There are moments in life that don't arrive with a bang. No explosion, no warning, no time to prepare. They simply appear quietly and change everything. That afternoon, Ethan Walker drove his old pickup truck along the snow-covered highway leading out of town. Late winter in Montana was cold enough that each breath turned into a thin cloud of vapor, dissolving quickly into the wind. On both sides of the road stretched barren, silvery gray fields, endless and exposed, much like the life he had grown accustomed to over the years, monotonous, silent, and leaving no room for surprise. His daughter, Lily, sat in the back seat, her legs swinging to the rhythm of a song she had made up herself. Her voice was slightly off-key, innocent, but enough to fill the cabin with a rare sense of warmth. Ethan heard it, but he wasn't really listening. His mind was somewhere else, a place he had spent years trying to avoid. Then he saw the patrol car pulled over on the shoulder. The hood was wide open. Thin white smoke rose from the engine, blending into the biting cold air. There were no other vehicles around, just the empty road and one person standing beside the car, dressed in a police uniform, her back turned toward him. Ethan slowed down. He was used to not stopping. Life had taught him that the less involved you were, the less trouble you invited. But that day, something made him signal, steer toward the shoulder and turn off the engine. "Dad?" Lily lifted her head. "What's going on?" "It's nothing," Ethan said calmly. "Just stay in the car, okay?" He stepped out, his boots crunching against frozen gravel with a dry, brittle sound. The wind slipped through his collar, sending a slight shiver down his spine. The officer turned at the sound of his footsteps, and then she took off her sunglasses. In that moment, the world seemed to freeze. Not because of the wind, not because of the cold, but because of the face in front of him. A face he had spent 12 years trying to forget. Claire Monroe. The woman who had once known all his habits. The woman who had once promised she would come back. The woman who had left without a single explanation. Time had changed her. Her features were sharper, her gaze deeper. She stood straight, steady, the posture of someone accustomed to responsibility and discipline. But her eyes, Ethan recognized them instantly. The eyes that had once looked at him as if he were her entire world. Now, those eyes looked at him as though trying to confirm an old memory. "Ethan?" Claire spoke. Her voice was low and even, yet faintly unsteady, as if she herself wasn't entirely sure she was calling the right person. He nodded once, said, "Nothing, nothing." Because if he opened his mouth, he didn't know whether he could keep his voice steady. Behind him, Lily shifted in her seat, still humming her song. The sound pulled Ethan back into reality, reminding him that he was no longer the 20-something man he used to be. He was a father now. He had a life carefully built on control and avoidance. But Claire was standing there, flesh and blood, not a memory, not a dream. "My car, a hose burst," Claire said, stepping aside to let him look into the engine bay. Her tone was professional, measured, like she was speaking to a stranger. Ethan stepped closer. Heat from the engine brushed against his face. He recognized the problem immediately. A small issue, the kind that shouldn't have left someone stranded on a freezing highway. Had she called for roadside assistance? Probably. But the question never left his lips. Instead, he realized something that made his chest feel heavy. Claire didn't ask him anything beyond the immediate situation. She didn't ask how he had been living, didn't ask if he was okay, didn't ask if he had anyone with him now. As if the past 12 years had never existed. From inside the truck, Lily called out, "Dad, are we going home yet?" Her voice was clear and carefree. Claire turned toward the sound. Her gaze paused just for a fraction of a second, But Ethan caught the change. It wasn't exactly sadness. It was something closer to a loss that had just been named. "That's your daughter?" Claire asked. "Yeah," Ethan replied. One word. Nothing. Nothing more. Claire nodded slowly as if the answer had been waiting somewhere inside her for a long time. The wind grew stronger. Snow drifted lightly across the road. Time kept moving forward, but for Ethan, this moment had opened a door he once believed he had locked forever. He didn't yet know that from that instant on, everything he had built over the past 12 years, the peace, the safety, the silence, had already begun to crack. And he didn't yet know that this meeting was not an accident. It was the beginning. Ethan started the engine and guided the truck back onto the snow-covered road. The pickup shuddered lightly beneath the wheels, the familiar sound steady and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a life carefully arranged. Lily resumed talking about her day at school, about the drawing she hadn't finished yet, about the cake she wanted to eat that evening. Small, harmless stories. Ethan listened, nodded at the right moments, and responded with short replies. But his mind was not there. It had traveled far backwards. Claire Monroe was back in Oak Ridge. That single thought alone was enough to make the air inside the cab feel heavier. Ethan didn't need the rearview mirror to know what his face looked like now. He felt his jaw tighten, his hands gripping the steering wheel more firmly than necessary. 12 years ago, he had learned one thing. Don't ask why people leave, because some answers never come, and if they do, they arrive too late. The town appeared ahead of them, small and familiar, like an old habit that refused to disappear. The gas station, the bakery, the family-owned grocery store with its faded wooden sign. Everything was still there. Everything looked the same. Only he had changed. And perhaps Claire had too. That evening, after Lily had fallen fast asleep, Ethan sat alone in the kitchen. Yellow light spilt across the wooden table where he had once calculated every expense, every harvest, every long day strung together without surprises. He poured himself a glass of water but didn't drink it. A restless, nameless unease made him stand up, then sit back down again. Outside, the wind hissed through the leafless trees, carrying the familiar scent of cold, earthy soil. He remembered the last time he had seen Claire, not on the highway earlier that day, but in a cramped cafe in the city, where everything had felt loud and unfamiliar. She had sat across from him, both hands resting on the table, her eyes red but dry. No tears. Just one sentence. "I can't." And that had been enough to end everything. The next day, the news spread faster than Ethan expected. In a small town, nothing is ever truly secret. People said a new female police officer had transferred in. Some recognized the last name Monroe. Others simply nodded, treating it as an unimportant detail. But for Ethan, every mention felt like a small needle pressing into an old scar. He began avoiding town whenever he could, taking longer routes, sending Margaret to run errands. He claimed he was busy with the farm. His life had long been accustomed to needing no one else, so narrowing it further wasn't tricky. The problematic part was this. The more he avoided, the more he thought. He thought about the way Claire had looked at Lily. Not the polite glance of an adult toward a stranger's child, but something more profound, quieter, as if she were seeing a possibility, a path that had never been taken. Lily, on the other hand, carried none of that weight. To her, Claire was simply the police lady with the broken car, an adult who needed help, and that was enough. Lily asked Ethan why the police officer had come back to town. Ethan told her that sometimes people return because of work. Lily nodded, accepting the answer as easily as children accept things before they learn how to doubt. One weekend morning, Ethan had no choice but to go into town. The farmer's market was busier than usual. Laughter, the smell of freshly baked bread, the clink of cups and glasses. He held Lily's hand, moving through the stalls with unnecessary caution. And then, as if the small town were deliberately teasing him, Claire was there, near the honey stand, her hair neatly tied back, wearing a dark coat, standing with the same familiar upright posture. When their eyes met, Ethan felt something strange. No shock anymore, only exhaustion. Exhaustion from pretending this didn't matter. Exhaustion from playing the role of someone no longer affected by the past. Claire was the one who approached first. Not hurried, not evasive. She bent down to greet Lily first, asked her name, and inquired about what she liked at the market. Lily answered clearly, even mentioning how her dad always let her choose the cake as long as she promised to share it with Margaret. Claire smiled, a brief smile, but enough for Ethan to realize that some smiles, no matter how long it's been, never really change. Ethan didn't say much. He pulled Lily along, using the excuse that they needed to get home. Claire didn't stop him, didn't ask. She just stood there watching them go, as if she were used to being left behind. That evening, while closing up the farm, Ethan lingered longer than usual. The sky hung low and gray, starless. He recognized an uncomfortable truth. Claire hadn't just returned to the town. She had returned to his life. And whether he wanted it or not, her return had already begun to unsettle everything. He had once believed that if he didn't mention it, if he didn't face it, the past would remain obediently still. But now it had stood up, knocked on the door, and looked straight at him. The question was no longer whether he would run into Claire again. It was this: what would he do when the thing he had tried hardest to forget decided to stay? Ethan once believed he had learned how to control everything. His life, from the farm to every single meal, was neatly arranged around fixed routines. He woke up early, worked until dark, drove Lily to school, picked her up, and ate dinner at the same hour every evening. Each day passed just like the one before, and he had grown used to that. The regularity spared him from thinking too much, from remembering, from feeling. But Lily was different. She did not live by memory. She lived in the present. After the encounter at the farmer's market, Lily mentioned Claire more often than Ethan had expected, not with difficult questions, but with observations that were childlike and innocent. "That police officer smiles kindly. She asked me what kind of cake I like. I think she's nice." Lily said these things while coloring, while eating breakfast, at moments when Ethan thought the subject had already been discussed. Ethan merely murmured in response. He didn't want to continue that conversation. Not because he was angry, but because he was afraid. Afraid that if it stayed in this house any longer, it would bring with it things he wasn't ready to face. But a small town doesn't offer many choices. A few days later, Ethan had to take Lily into town to buy supplies for the irrigation system. The hardware store was busier than usual. Lily ran along the aisles, fascinated by rows of paint color samples hanging in long displays. Ethan stood a few steps away, holding the shopping list, his mind drifting. Then he heard a familiar voice. "Hello there." Ethan turned. Claire stood at the end of the aisle, this time in a full police uniform, a radio clipped to her shoulder, a utility belt around her waist. No longer the woman he had met on the roadside or at the market. She was doing her job, standing straight, confident, and undeniably real. Lily recognized her immediately. "You're the police officer with the broken car," she exclaimed, her voice bright with excitement, as if she had just run into an old friend. Claire smiled and crouched down to Lily's eye level. "That's right. My car is fixed now." "That's good," Lily said right away. "Police officers need their cars to help people." The simple statement made Claire freeze for a brief moment. Ethan noticed it. Just a tiny pause, but enough for him to understand that some words, even spoken without intent, still find the softest places in a person. Claire reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small plastic badge, the kind police departments often give children at community events. She placed it into Lily's hand. "This is an honorary badge," Claire said. "Just for you." Lily's eyes lit up. She held the badge as if it were a treasure. "Thank you," she said repeatedly, then turned toward Ethan, showing it off with unmistakable pride. Ethan stood there, silent. He felt something inside his chest crack open, gently. Not pain, but a strange sensation, like a familiar wall beginning to shift. He looked at Claire. For a brief moment, her eyes met his. No pleading, no accusation, just a quiet, unspoken question. "Do you see it now?" On the drive home, Lily talked non-stop about the badge. She clipped it onto her backpack, took it off, then clipped it back on again, as if afraid that if she didn't keep looking at it, it might disappear. "Dad," Lily said casually, "why don't you like that police officer?" The question came so suddenly that Ethan almost slammed on the brakes. He looked at her through the rearview mirror. "Why do you think that?" "I don't know," Lily shrugged. "It's just, when you look at her, you look like you're mad, but you don't say anything." Ethan was quiet. Children often see things that adults tend to underestimate. They don't analyze. They feel. "I'm not mad," he said after a moment. "I just don't know her." Lily nodded, accepting the answer. "I think she's nice. Maybe we could get to know her better." Ethan had no reply. He stared at the road ahead where the snow along the roadside was melting into patches of gray slush. The plastic badge lay on the center seat, small yet heavier than anything he had carried in years. In the days that followed, Ethan began to notice something. Claire appeared more often than he had expected. At the diner, on the road home, near the fields, sometimes just passing by. Sometimes exchanging a few brief words, never intrusive, never forcing anything, but enough to make it impossible for him to pretend she didn't exist. He started avoiding town, taking longer routes, coming home earlier. But no matter how hard he tried, Lily kept bringing Claire home with her, in stories, in imagination, in the trusting light of her eyes. And Ethan realized something he had overlooked for years. He couldn't teach his daughter to love life if he himself was always afraid of it. Lily didn't know the past, didn't know about broken promises, didn't know about the nights he had spent alone trying to understand why people leave. But perhaps because of that, she saw everything more clearly. And for the first time since Claire returned, Ethan asked himself, was he protecting his daughter? Or merely running from his own old pain? Night fell faster than Ethan expected. The last light of the sunset drained from the fields behind the farm, leaving a cold gray haze that spread evenly across the ground, over the weathered wooden fence, and over the stretches of silence he had grown accustomed to. Fixing the fence was usually the kind of work that kept his mind occupied, but tonight, each nail he drove in echoed inside him like questions without answers. Then the headlights swept across the field. Ethan looked up. A patrol car pulled in, stopping a few dozen meters from the barn. The engine shut off. The door opened. A figure stepped out, slow, deliberate. He didn't need to see clearly to know who it was. Claire. She held a flashlight, its narrow beam cutting across the frozen ground. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and cold metal. Ethan wiped his hands on his pants and stepped out of the barn's shadow. He forced his face into emptiness, the way he had taught himself to do over the years. "I saw the lights," Claire spoke first. Her voice was professional, official. "I wanted to make sure everything was okay." "It's fine," Ethan replied. "Just fixing the fence." Claire nodded. She could have turned around. She could have gotten back in her car and driven away. But she didn't. Silence stretched between them, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that forces a person to listen to their own thoughts. The wind tugged at Claire's coat, making the hem flutter slightly. Ethan felt his grip tighten around the hammer more than necessary. "Ethan," Claire said, her voice lower this time, "I owe you an explanation." He let out a quiet laugh. There was no humor in it. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," Claire said. "I left without telling you why. That was wrong." Ethan turned his back, pretending to adjust a wooden plank. "It's been 12 years, he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Whatever you say now doesn't change anything." "But it changes how you understand," Claire replied. That made Ethan stop. The flashlight lowered. Claire stood there, unguarded, unhidden. She took a deep breath, as if reminding herself to stay steady. "When I left," she said, "I was pregnant." There was no sound except the wind. Ethan turned to face her. His mind needed a few seconds to process the words. What did you say?" "I found out after you proposed," Claire continued, her voice steady but strained. "I was scared. I was too young. I didn't know how to tell you." Ethan felt the ground beneath him sway. "Then why?" "Because I lost the baby," Claire said quickly, as if she wouldn't have the courage if she didn't say it all at once. "Just a few weeks later." The words hung in the cold air. Ethan couldn't remember when he had last taken a breath. His chest ached, not with anger, but with a sudden emptiness, as if something important had been placed in his hands, only to reveal it had been shattered long ago. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why did you let me believe that I wasn't enough?" Claire shook her head. "It was never because of you. Never." She looked down for a moment, then back up. "I believed that if I stayed, I would drag you down with my fear. I thought leaving was the only way not to hurt you." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "And you thought disappearing would hurt less?" Claire closed her eyes. "I was wrong." That admission didn't calm Ethan's anger. It only made everything more complicated. He turned away, placing both hands on the fence post, feeling the rough grain beneath his palms. He thought about the years that had passed, about the ring that was never worn, about the long nights spent wondering what he had done wrong. "I would have stayed with you," he said, not turning back, "no matter how afraid you were. You didn't have to carry that alone." "I know," Claire said softly. "I know that now. But back then, all I saw was that I wasn't enough, not strong enough to be a mother, not certain enough to be a wife." Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't want to hear any more, but he couldn't hear. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Claire continued. "I just wanted you to know the truth. I've carried it for 12 years. The truth, a word heavier than the wind sweeping across the field. Ethan turned back. The flashlight illuminated Claire's face, revealing lines of exhaustion he had never noticed before. No longer the girl he once loved, and no longer a stranger. She stood somewhere in between, with everything that had been lost. "You should go," Ethan said at last. His voice no longer held anger, only weariness. "I need time." Claire nodded. No pleading, no protest. "I'm sorry," she said, then turned back toward her car. The engine started, fading into the distance. The headlights disappeared beyond the bend. Ethan stood alone in the darkness, his hands still resting on the fence post. For the first time in a long while, he no longer knew what he was protecting, his past, his present, or his own fear. The truth had been spoken. and now he had to live with it. 3 days had passed since the night behind the barn, but for Ethan, time no longer seemed to be measured in hours or days. It was measured in brief moments, moments when he suddenly realized a new truth, only to remind himself that the truth had always existed. He simply hadn't known it. He worked more than usual, fixed things that weren't broken, reinforced fences that had stood firm through countless winters. The labor left his body sore, but his mind refused to settle. Every time he paused, the image of Claire standing beneath the flashlight returned, her expression painfully calm, her voice steady as she confessed something that could have shattered everything. Ethan didn't tell Lily what had happened. She still went to school, still laughed, still clipped the plastic badge onto her backpack every morning. Each time he saw it, a dull ache pierced his chest. He thought about the child who was never born, about a possibility that had been cut short, about how, if things had been different, Lily might not have been the only child in this house. The news arrived on a gray afternoon. Ethan was at the feed store when he overheard two men talking near the counter. Their voices were low, as if discussing something not meant to be said aloud, but in a small town, every story finds a way to travel. "That new police officer?" one of them said. "I hear she's up for a promotion, transferring to the city to take a command position." Ethan froze. His hand was still resting on a sack of feed, but he could no longer feel its weight. The other man nodded. "Yeah, big opportunity. Probably within the month." This month. A short phrase, yet enough to pull Ethan back 12 years, to when Claire had left just as quickly, without warning, without explanation, leaving behind a void he had spent years learning how to live with. On the drive home, Ethan didn't turn on the radio. The engine hummed steadily, monotonously. The road stretched ahead, but he didn't really see it. Instead, he saw a familiar pattern repeating itself. Claire being offered an opportunity, Claire leaving, and him remaining behind, gathering pieces he never knew how to put back together. "Dad," Lily spoke from the back seat. "Are you tired?" "No," Ethan answered too quickly. "I'm fine." But he knew he was lying. That evening, he stayed outside on the farm until complete darkness fell. Margaret stood in the kitchen watching through the window, but she didn't call him in. She had learned that sometimes silence was the only way to stand beside someone who was trying not to break. Ethan told himself that if he kept his distance, if he didn't let Claire come any closer, then this time it wouldn't hurt as much as before. He reminded himself that he was older now, more experienced, that he already knew how this would end, so there was nothing left to lose. But that very thought led him to a more frightening realization. He wasn't avoiding that pain. He was preparing for it. The next day he avoided town, asked Margaret to run errands, declined a neighbor's dinner invitation. He shrank his world, as if making it small enough would leave no room for fear to slip in. But fear doesn't need space. It only needs memory. Whenever he thought of Claire, Ethan remembered the last thing she had said that night. "I'm not asking you to forgive me." It didn't sound like a farewell. It sounded like a door left ajar, not forcing him to walk through, but not allowing him to pretend it wasn't there. 3 days later, Margaret set a cup of tea down in front of him. "Have you heard the news?" she asked gently. Ethan didn't need to ask what she meant. "I have." "What do you think?" He shrugged. "She always leaves." Margaret looked at him for a long time. Her gaze held neither blame nor comfort, just a quiet observation, as if she were seeing an 8-year-old boy again, the child who had lost his parents and learned not to expect anything from anyone. "What are you afraid of?" Margaret asked. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He was about to say he was afraid Lily would get hurt, afraid she would trust the wrong person, but deep down he knew that wasn't the honest answer. He was afraid to hope. Afraid to believe that this time would be different. Afraid that if Claire stayed, he would have to open his heart, and that meant risking loss all over again. "I think I'm protecting Lily," he said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Maybe. But maybe you're just protecting yourself." Those words followed Ethan through the night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind strike the windows. He thought about the life he had built, safe, controlled, free of surprises. And for the first time, he wondered whether that safety was truly living or merely existing. Somewhere out there, Claire was standing before a choice, and whether Ethan wanted it or not, that choice was pulling him back toward a place he had worked so hard to leave. A place called hope. And this time, he didn't know whether he still dared to face it. That evening, the house was tranquil. Lily had gone to sleep early. She was curled beneath her blanket, her backpack neatly placed by the chair, the plastic badge still appropriately clipped to the zipper. Ethan stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment, his hand resting on the doorframe, listening to the steady, familiar rhythm of her breathing. Some sounds bring comfort. Others bring fear because they remind us that something precious is just out of our reach. He closed the door gently and went downstairs to the kitchen. Margaret had already made tea. She sat in the chair by the window, the one that still looked out over the backyard and the darkened fields beyond. The soft yellow kitchen light made the room feel warm, yet Ethan felt the distance between himself and the wooden table stretch longer than usual. "You look tired," Margaret said evenly, without reproach. "Probably because I've been working a lot," Ethan replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down. He lifted the teacup but didn't drink right away. The heat rose toward his face, carrying the familiar scent of herbs. Margaret was quiet for a while. She always was, giving others enough time to speak what they were trying to hold back. Then she placed her hands on the table, fingers interlaced. "She came to see you, didn't she?" Margaret asked. Ethan wasn't surprised. "Yes." "And you heard about the promotion?" He nodded. "The whole town has." Margaret looked at him for a long time, not with scrutiny, but with the gaze of someone who had seen many people build walls around themselves. "What are you most afraid of right now?" she asked. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He thought of many answers, that he was afraid Lily would be hurt, afraid his life would be disrupted, and afraid of uncertainty. But spoken aloud, they all sounded like carefully sharpened excuses. "I'm afraid," he said finally, "that if I believe, I'll lose." Margaret nodded gently, as if she had been waiting for that answer. "Fear of loss doesn't make you weak," she said. "It just makes you human." Ethan looked down at the table. "I've already lost," he said quietly. "Once was enough." "Maybe," Margaret replied, "but avoidance isn't a way to live with loss. It's only a way to prolong fear." She stood up and poured more tea. The sound of the water was soft and steady. "Do you remember when you were 8?" she asked. Ethan frowned slightly. "I do." "When your parents died, you didn't cry," Margaret said. "You told your aunt you were fine. You said you didn't need anyone. And she believed you, because she thought maybe letting you believe that would help you stay standing." She turned to look at him. "But the truth is, you made a promise to yourself that day." Ethan looked up. "What promise?" "That you would never let anyone get close enough to hurt you again." The words fell into the kitchen like a heavy object. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had never thought of it that way before, but hearing it now, he knew it was true. "You've built a very good life," Margaret continued. "You're a devoted father. You work hard. You keep everything safe. She paused. But safety isn't always enough. Ethan thought of Lily, of her eyes when she showed off the badge, of the way she looked at Claire, not with suspicion, but with curiosity and trust. I think I'm protecting Lily, he said. Margaret shook her head very slightly. Maybe, but Lily needs more than protection. She needs to see her father dare to live honestly, dare to believe, dare to be wrong if necessary. Ethan was silent. Outside, the wind rose again, passing through the bare trees. He felt a profound exhaustion, not of the body, but of someone who had held on to fear for far too long. If I open my heart, he said, his voice rough, and everything breaks again, I don't know if I can survive it. Margaret stepped closer and placed her hand on his shoulder, warm, steady. You don't need to know in advance whether you'll survive, she said. You just need to know that avoidance won't make you stronger. It will only make you lonelier. She withdrew her hand and gave him a sad smile. In the end, this isn't a decision about her. It's a decision about the kind of man you want to be, in front of your daughter. That night, Ethan lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Margaret's words weren't loud or forceful, but they clung to him. He thought about the life he had chosen, calm, predictable, without risk. He also thought about the rare moments in his life when he had dared to believe, dared to love, dared to wait. Slowly, clearly, he realized one thing. He had never truly been protecting Lily from pain. He had only been protecting himself from having to face it. And for the first time since Claire returned, Ethan understood that the decision ahead of him, whatever it might be, would not only shape his future, it would shape the way Lily learned how to love this world. And that realization meant he could no longer remain silent. That morning arrived very slowly. Not because the sun was lazy, but because Ethan had been awake since before dawn. He lay still in bed, watching the ceiling change color with each layer of pale light, listening to the familiar sounds of the farm waking up, the wind slipping through the cracks of the doors, the faint clink of metal from the barn, and the distant footsteps of Margaret moving around the kitchen. Those sounds had once been his anchor, reminding him that life kept going, no matter how tangled the human heart became. He sat up, pulled on his jacket, and stepped outside. He had no specific plan, only the feeling that if he stayed inside the house any longer, he wouldn't be able to breathe. The north fence needed fixing. Familiar work. Ethan picked up the hammer and drove the nails in steadily and measuredly. But this time, his mind didn't drift as it had in the days before. It stayed fixed on a single point. The question Margaret had asked, repeating quietly but relentlessly. Whom are you protecting? The sound of a car reached him from the end of the driveway. Ethan looked up. A patrol car rolled in slowly and stopped near the house. No siren, no urgency, just an ordinary arrival, and yet he knew there was nothing ordinary about this moment. Claire stepped out of the car. She wasn't in uniform, just jeans, a dark jacket, her hands tucked into her pockets. She stopped a few steps away, not moving closer, not pushing, as if waiting for the smallest signal that she was allowed to continue. I'm sorry for coming by unannounced, Claire said. Her voice was calm, but Ethan heard something else beneath it, not fear, but a determination held tightly in place. It's okay, he replied, and this time the words were valid. They stood there in the dew-covered field in silence. Not the heavy silence from before. This one felt like the pause before someone chooses to say something important, knowing that if it isn't said now, it may never be said at all. I've been thinking a lot, Claire said. I've practiced saying what I need to say, dozens of times. But standing here now, I realize. There's no way to make this any easier. Ethan set the hammer down and turned toward her. He didn't avoid her gaze anymore. "Go on," he said. Claire took a deep breath. "I didn't come to ask for your forgiveness. And I didn't come to ask you to trust me." She paused, making sure every word landed exactly as she meant it to. "I just want you to know one thing. I'm not leaving." Ethan felt his heart tighten slightly. "Not for work," Claire continued. "Not for opportunity. I turned down the offer." He looked at her, incredulous. "Why?" "Because I don't want to run anymore," Claire said simply. 12 years ago I left because I was afraid. I thought I would be stronger if I stayed away from everything that made me feel weak. I was wrong. She lifted her eyes to his, steady and open. "I didn't come back to fix the past. I know I can't. I came back because I want to live differently, even if it's harder." Ethan wanted to say many things, to tell her she was making a mistake, that this town wouldn't give her what she deserved, that staying here with him would only complicate everything. But none of those words left his mouth, because for the first time, he saw what he hadn't dared to see before. Claire wasn't standing in front of him, hoping to be saved. She was standing there with her own choice. "I don't expect this to be easy," Claire said. "I know it will take time. I know you have every right to say no. If you don't want me near, I'll respect that." She paused. "But I won't disappear again. Not because it's easier. Not because I'm afraid." A deep weariness washed over Ethan, not the exhaustion of pain, but the relief of finally letting go. He remembered the years spent in safety, control, and avoidance. Remembered how he had trained himself to expect nothing from anyone, so that he wouldn't be disappointed. And then he thought of Lily, of the way she trusted so completely. As Margaret had said, safety is not always about living. "I don't know where this will lead," Ethan said slowly. "I'm not promising anything." Claire nodded. "I don't need a promise." He took a breath, then spoke the words he had been avoiding for days. "Would you like to have some coffee?" A simple question, almost ordinary, but it carried the weight of a decision. Claire froze for a brief moment. Then she smiled, not wide, not overflowing, just a soft smile, as if she had prepared herself for every possible answer except this one. "Yes," she said. "I would." Ethan gestured toward the house. They walked together across the yard, not touching, but not keeping distance either. The silence between them was no longer sharp. It was softer, easier to breathe in. Inside the kitchen, Margaret was sitting with Lily, helping, her color. Lily looked up when she saw them, her eyes lighting up. Claire bent down to examine the drawing, praising Lily's choice of colors. Lily smiled, proudly showing off the badge still clipped to her backpack. Margaret looked at Ethan over Lily's head, saying, "Nothing." But in her eyes was a gentle understanding, as if she knew that what mattered most had just happened wasn't who came back or who stayed. It was that Ethan had chosen not to turn away from himself. And sometimes, courage doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be spoken through a very ordinary sentence. "Would you like to have some coffee?" 3 months passed, and the farm looked the same. The southern field still stretched all the way to the horizon. The barn still carried the scent of dry hay and old wood. The north fence, where Ethan had made repairs that morning, stood firm through the early spring winds. From the distance, no one would say that life here had changed. But Ethan knew it had. Change did not arrive with grand declarations. It came through small, ordinary details, things that only revealed themselves when a person stopped avoiding and began paying attention. Claire came on her days off, not on a fixed schedule, not with much notice. Sometimes she helped Ethan replace a light bulb in the shed. Sometimes she sat on the front steps reading to Lily while he was still working. Sometimes they would simply drink coffee together in the kitchen, talking about unimportant things, the weather, the crops, or a newly repaired road in town. No one named what that relationship was. There was no need to. Ethan learned not to push things too quickly. He also learned not to pull away every time something began to feel familiar, because familiarity to him had once meant loss. There were days he still startled when he saw Claire's car turn into the driveway, moments when he had to remind himself that this time she was here by choice, not because she was running. Lily was the first to feel the change. She didn't ask difficult questions. She simply accepted that there was now another person in her space, someone who listened, who smiled, who was patient. Lily showed Claire her new drawings, her homework questions, even the small things children often guard closely as if they were treasures. Ethan watched from a distance, sometimes with a thin, fragile fear, the fear that if he let things go any further, he would no longer be able to control the outcome. But then he remembered what Margaret had said, that life doesn't need guarantees to be meaningful. It only needs presence. The walls Ethan had built did not collapse overnight. They cracked slowly through small moments, an accidental touch of hands while fixing a leaky pipe, a shared laugh when Lily said something innocent, an evening sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, no one speaking, and no one feeling the need to. There were days when the past returned. On those days, Ethan withdrew, growing quieter. Claire didn't press him, didn't force anything. She simply stayed, like a truth that didn't need to be proven. And it was that, more than anything, that slowly taught Ethan that staying, sometimes, is the bravest act of all. One evening after Lily had gone to sleep, Ethan and Claire sat on the porch. The air was cool, the breeze light. The field before them was washed in the pale purple of a late sunset. Claire rested her head against his shoulder, very gently, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. Ethan didn't move. He let it be. Let the moment exist in its own way. "I'm glad I came back," Claire said, almost in a whisper. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Me too." This time, he didn't have to convince himself. He thought about love, not the loud romantic thing once promised in youth, but something slower, more careful, and more honest. A love that knows it can hurt, yet still chooses to stay. A love that doesn't promise to cause pain, but promises not to disappear when pain comes. Ethan looked out over the fields where he had built his life during its hardest years. He realized that what had frightened him for so long was not the risk of losing again, but the risk of allowing himself to believe that something might be worth risking for. Now, he was no longer sure about the future. There were no long-term plans, no written promises. But he had something he had never allowed himself before. A present, not ruled by fear. The farm was the same. The town was still small. Life still carried heavy days and tiring ones, but within all of that, Ethan knew his life was no longer his alone. It belonged to the choices he dared to make, to the people he allowed to stay, and to the belief, fragile but real, that living entirely is always worth more than living safely. As night fell, Ethan sat quietly, listening to the insects begin their soft chorus across the fields. He thought that perhaps happiness was not the absence of pain. Perhaps it was simply the ability to look pain in the eye and still choose to open one's heart. And for him, that was enough. Some stories don't end with a grand moment. No wedding ring, no lifetime promises, no declaration that everything will be perfect from now on. Ethan's story was one of those. Everything that followed unfolded very slowly. So slowly that if you weren't paying attention, you might think nothing had changed at all. But it was within that slowness that Ethan learned something he had never allowed himself to understand for years. Not every transformation needs noise to matter. Claire did not step into their lives as an answer. She didn't come to repair the past, nor did she try to fill old voids with belated explanations. She was simply there, steady, consistent, and real. She didn't promise more than she could keep. Ethan noticed it gradually. He watched as Claire was patient with Lily, never trying to become too much in the child's life. Just an adult who knew how to listen. Someone who didn't disappear when things grew quiet. Someone who stayed, even on days when there was nothing to say. And Ethan realized that perhaps this was what he had been missing for the past 12 years. Not love, but unconditional presence. There were mornings when Ethan still woke up with a vague sense of anxiety. Old memories sometimes returned without warning. The what-if questions still slipped into his mind now and then, especially on difficult days at the farm when things didn't go according to plan. But unlike before, he no longer lets them dictate his decisions. He began to understand that fear doesn't disappear just because one confronts it. It disappears when it is no longer allowed to decide for you. One late spring afternoon, Ethan stood outside with Lily. She was drawing with chalk on the concrete path, a house, a sun, and 3 figures standing side by side. Ethan looked at the drawing longer than necessary, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. "Dad," Lily said, not looking up, "are you happy?" The question came lightly, as if the answer were obvious. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "Yes, I think I am." It wasn't the most confident answer, but it was the most honest one he had ever given. On another evening, as Claire was getting ready to leave, Ethan stood at the door, watching her walk toward her car. He realized that the tightness in his chest was gone. The fear that every goodbye might be the last had faded. "Will you come by tomorrow?" he asked naturally. Claire smiled. "If you want me to." Ethan nodded. "I do." That answer, once the hardest thing for him to say, had now become simple. And perhaps that was the most significant change of all. Ethan's life didn't become easier. The farm still needed care. Long days still existed, worries still appeared, but he no longer lived with the feeling that he had to face everything alone. He understood that opening one's heart is not a promise never to be hurt again. It is simply an acceptance that living closed off is also a form of loss. Claire did not replace the past. She did not erase the years Ethan had spent in silence, but she showed him that people can change. Not through promises, but through the way they stay. And Ethan, for the first time in a very long while, allowed himself to believe that this was enough to begin. Perhaps a second chance is not a gift that is given. Perhaps it is a choice, made again and again each day, not to turn away when fear knocks at the door. Ethan looked out across the fields as the sun sank slowly behind the trees. He thought about his life, about what had been lost, and about what remained. There was no longer a tearing sense of regret, only a quiet, genuine peace, the kind that comes from no longer running away. And if you're listening to this story, perhaps you've stood before a similar choice yourself. Perhaps you've wondered whether someone deserves a second chance. The answer doesn't lie with them. It lies in whether you are willing to live truthfully with yourself. Some stories don't teach us how to avoid pain. They teach us how to live with it without losing our identity. If this story resonated with you, Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Like if you believe people can change. Share if you think someone needs to hear this story today. And don't forget to subscribe to Deep Life Tales, where we tell stories of loss, hope, and the courage to open one's heart one more time. See you in the following story.